Hello. Yes. Hello, everyone. Oh. Here. Sorry. I forgot how it is. Thank you so much. Welcome, everyone. I'm so happy to see so many of you in this lovely sunny morning. Welcome to the European Ukrainian Hub, and thank you for the Hub for hosting us. Today, I'm really excited to host an amazing conversation between excellent experts, and we're really also excited to hear about your views on this topic of Ukraine, the EU, how we're all going to have a future together, basically, and the shared identities that we share and how we can connect these. The program for today, as you know, is first we'll have a brief presentation by our first expert, Magnus Lund Nielsen, who will give us a brief presentation of his latest finding of his work, working on European identity. Afterwards, we'll delve into a very exciting panel discussion with the four excellent panelists behind me, and where we will continue our conversations. So without further ado, I think, Magnus, I will let you introduce yourself, because you can do it better than me. But I'm really looking forward to hear everything in our program today. So over to you, Magnus, and give him a hand.
Thank you. So am I coming out loud and clear? Yeah, that's great. Good morning, everyone. My name is Magnus. I graduated 3 weeks ago from Copenhagen Business School with a master's in political communication and management. And my final thesis was a thesis on how Ukraine, how political elites in Kyiv and Brussels perceive the EU, and what differences between the two how they might be telling of a shared common future, as so we was just referring to. So today I want to tell you about two things. If you learn anything from my brief 20 minutes, I hope you learn about two things. The one thing is populism, and I think probably for a lot of you an alternative definition of what populism is. And then secondly, the reason we're here, Ukraine's perception of the EU. Just a quick background. As I mentioned before, my name is Magnus. I'm also working as a journalist, and back in the fall of 2022, I was with some friends in Lviv, and what really struck me there in the western part of Ukraine was just the sheer amount of EU flags. Like they were flying from churches, public buildings, balconies, you name it. And it just made me wonder, because surely you'll spend some time in Copenhagen, you also realize that it is rare that you come across an EU flag. And it just made me wonder, what does the EU, this flag, represent to Ukrainians that it so obviously doesn't represent to us? We don't fly it as often. And how is this different in perception might be telling of a shared future. So just a quick background. I only have 20 minutes, and honestly, I also just want to fast forward to get on to the very exciting panel that we have in a brief moment. But just some quick background on the study I've done. This is a discourse analysis, meaning it's qualitative. It's interviews with political actors in Kyiv. I was there fall last year, and political actors in Brussels. And it's a constructivist approach. What the hell does that mean? It essentially just means that I've sort of let the interviewees paint the picture, create the world. I have strived to remove myself from the picture to the largest extent possible. And then the first thing that I want you guys to maybe pick up on a bit, because the sort of the catchline for today's event was populism and identity. And populism might have, for a lot of you guys, also used to have for me, sort of a negative ring to it. And I want to sort of challenge that. Because what I have worked with is a definition of populism formulated, phrased by a guy called Magnus Lund Nielsen. And instead of thinking of populism as sort of inherently an ideology, think of it as rather a way of articulating politics. It's a specific logic that constructs a popular pole and in opposition to a power block, to the elite, so to speak. It makes a number of different demands and puts them together in what we call sort of a chain of equivalence. That is to say that if people living in a village experience that the bus that they belong for is not showing up, and some other people in the same village realize, well, we're not having hot water coming out of our tap. Those two demands all of a sudden share an identity in the way that they're not fulfilled. And all of a sudden they at least it fertilizes the ground for them to sort of be melted together. And that's sort of the key to what we're getting at here. It can be represented through an empty symbol. Example of populism that I think we all know of is Trump, for instance. The name Trump simplifies everything from low taxes to fighting the book, whatever. Essentially, Trump as a signifier doesn't mean anything. It can mean everything and it can mean nothing. That's the background. So, what have I been doing? I have been conducting 15 interviews with 7 people in Brussels, 8 in Kyiv. It's a grand total of 12 hours of conversation with members of European Parliament, members of the Ukrainian Parliament, journalists, civil servants, people that I perceive to be sort of part of a political elite in these respective cities.
Please, is it your intention that we should be able to read what is written there?
Yes.
Could you place yourself?
I will. That was a very valid point. Thank you for the constructive criticism. It's gonna there you go. Yeah. Right. So, EU in Brussels. Here are some examples of what people say how the EU perceives itself when the EU talks about itself. In general, the main sort of takeaway of this is that the EU has this sort of, I would like to call sort of an antidote to populist logic, meaning that it's extremely differentiated. I just mentioned briefly before that things tend to sort of melt together in populism. That is quite the opposite that is happening in the EU. We have this very institutionalized approach. That is to say that every single issue is taken care of individually. The agriculture policy is negotiated within the agricultural policy. Economic policy is negotiated within economic policy. And also on another level, it's institutionalized in the way that all of these EU countries are not sort of, it's not a federal state, and that's not how they perceive it either. People in Brussels, they see it as a collective of 27 member states referring to the EU respectively. That is what I've tried to illustrate here. That you sort of have different countries referring to EU individually, and also these different policy areas all referring to EU, but it be taken care of individually. Right. Yeah. The thing of it is that this very institutionalized approach doesn't make for a very good sort of common European identity. That is to say that we might have these very sort of well-oiled machinery that really takes care of different parts of EU policy separately. But that doesn't really help us feel European. And also, when I did ask people in Brussels, like, how do you perceive, what does it mean to be European? They give, firstly, a very vague answer. Secondly, What they did, what they actually did said was that it's a sort of a peer system in the sense that you're both European and you also have your national identity, sort of reflecting the illustration I mentioned just before. Right, on to what we're actually here for. EU and Kyiv. I just want to highlight some of the some quite interesting quotes I found there. Just going to read the first one because I think it actually carries a lot of weight. You don't understand your countries, how important morally it is for us, for our soldiers, for us staying in our working places day by day, night by night. When some of your colleagues were telling me, but this is a mere bureaucratic decision granting candidate status to Ukraine, why do we need it? I said, if it's a mere bureaucratic decision, just make it. Because for us, it's not bureaucracy. You don't understand this. This is not the flags. This is about us being Europeans. And furthermore, when you actually sort of dive into asking people specifically, asking civil servants, journalists, and MPs in Kyiv, what does EU mean? What does it mean to the EU? Well, they hope that it's going to be more prosperous, more secure without wars. Prosperity in general is a thing that shows up a lot of time in interviews. A few more quotes, and I'm just going to go briefly over. Another thing of the way the EU as a signifier, as an idea in the Kyiv discourse operates, is that it constitutes an opposition to Russia. And through that, it also creates a Ukrainian identity. Sometimes one enemy can create unity, one single enemy, Russia. And another interesting point being made by an MP from the opposition party, Holos, is that she personally is from the western part of Ukraine, but she also sort of perceived this change of attitude within the Ukrainian community, coming by way of obviously the full-scale invasion by 2022, but also sort of encapsulated in the idea of the EU. You see this brotherhood and sisterhood sometimes changes. Something changes when you're fighting against the enemy. And then finally, the last quote I want to highlight here is that the movement towards the EU is also a movement, as this discourse, as these political actors in Kyiv saw it, it's also a movement towards a more institutionalized society. We go to the EU, we need this because it's the easiest and simplest way for political society to absorb experience instead of waiting for a revolution. I hope this makes sense. Right. Just some overall characteristics about the EU discourse in Kyiv. Ukraine society has been sort of rocked at its core several times over the last couple of decades. There's been a few revolutions. Most recently, of course, the biggest disruption has been the full-scale invasion of 2022. And what I've perceived that what I've observed that the political elite, these political actors in Kyiv seeks to do is that they seek to rearticulate the sort of Ukraine society amongst a couple of what we call signifiers. Essentially just words or ideas, concepts that show up in the discourse repeatedly. And one of these, most importantly, is the EU signifier. And then that again asks the question, well, what does the EU signifier then mean in this discourse? Well, a bit like what I talked about in terms of populism, it represents everything and nothing. It's emptied of meaning in the sense that it gets to represent both a striving for a better society, but it also gets to represent a more institutionalized, more well-oiled society, a more sort of sedimented public sector. And another very sort of potent factor of this EU signifier in the Kyiv discourse is that it provides for, at least as I perceive it in the Kyiv discourse, a very potent Ukrainian identity. It's an imagined community of a European community. They get to hang the Ukrainian identity on the nook of European identity. all of a sudden they've what in a society that, as the respondents described it themselves, has been historically quite fragmented. The EU provides for a sort of a common identity that a lot of Ukrainians buy into. I've put a sort of an asterisk at populism, because one of the sort of the key features of populism, at least in the idea of the list of the guy who sort of built the theoretic basics built this on, would say that this populism also needs sort of an opposition to an elite within society. That is, of course, not the opposition is to something external. Definitely, that is Russia. I've tried to visualize it like this. So you have the EU as an empty signifier, sort of collecting all these different sorts of demands in sort of what we call a chain of equivalence. Basically, just means a sort of a long line of demands that sets the sort of that becomes molded together, represented all by this EU signifier. So the strive for EU is just as much a strive for sovereignty. It's a strive for institutionalization. It's a strive for prosperity. Every person I asked about what the EU meant for them had a different answer. I think that's the main takeaway. And again, it gets this identity from this antagonizing position to Russia, the clear to outside to this. I just wanted to. This is I mentioned firstly that this is a qualitative study. I just wanted to add some quant to it. This is a UNUK scientist, researcher who's done continuous polling in Ukrainian society of how civic society notions have been evolving. And what this graph shows is that what I would at least suggest, and also what Ulrich herself suggests, is that the idea of joining the EU is actually prospering fast. It's growing faster than like identifying ethnically with Ukrainian or using Ukrainian in private life. The point is that these are the first polls, and this is the last polls. The first poll has been conducted in 2019, and the change in how many people use Ukrainian in private life hasn't changed drastically to May 2022. That's the big black one here. But if you look at how the notion of joining the EU has changed, it has changed quite drastically from 2019 till to May 2022. And this, to me, and to suggest that the sort of the formation of a civic and social identity as European is actually growing faster than a lot of other sort of civic society movements in Ukrainian society. I'm gonna leave you with this, and that's sort of what does this then all mean? The populism of the European Ukrainian, in my view, provides for a very potent political force to streamline a community's common efforts. That is to say that it's in the name of moving towards EU membership, you can sort of motivate and put together, pool a lot of resources in society to do, say, for instance, work against corruption, or engage themselves in civic society. Again, another point is that a part of this, I think I mentioned it, a part of this EU idea in Kyiv is that they long for a more institutionalized society. And so from both the Ukrainian and also from inside EU perspective, that is quite fruitful, because that means that people, rather than taking to the streets and conducting maybe another revolution, they, by way of this idea of the EU, they seek to build long lasting institutions that with rule of law, transparency, the whole works. Thirdly, it's offering an identity of the European Ukrainian. That's as I see it, and I think the data goes to show the same thing. It's bridging a divided society. And then on a more sour note, I'm going to leave you with that. This idea of the EU holds a lot of hopes, a lot of dreams in that. And as I said, every other person that you ask in Kyiv, at least the people I talk to, tend to have a different view of what the EU is. And this could bode for some disappointments down the road. Because as a Ukrainian EU membership gets closer, this chain of equivalences is going to fall apart. That is to say that all of a sudden, when we actually get down to the nitty-gritty and talk agricultural policy in terms of EU and Ukrainian membership, things are maybe going to fall apart. The star is going to lose sort of its shine, because all of a sudden it's very, very tactical. And I think the great thing about the concept of the EU and Ukrainian society today is that it has this potent collective force to streamline efforts in Ukrainian society. I think that is what I'm going to leave you with, and then I'm so looking forward to our panel.
Well, thank you so much. Now let's see if I can figure out how this goes again. Here. Thank you so much, Magnus, for this very interesting introduction for us and for the rest of our talk. Now I would like to invite the rest of our panel up on the stage for the next part of our program. Because what will happen now is we are going to not only reflect on your thoughts, but also hear each of your perspectives and each of your sectors that you work in. How are you perceiving this challenge and these opportunities? So without further ado, let's give our panel a round of applause, and you're welcome to join the stage. And you can take, and maybe if you, Vera, sit here just for the less confusion for the audience of names and who is who. Thank you. And yeah, there's a mic, and let me know if you need help with.
No, sorry, I just took somebody's.
So while we're doing a little bit of scene changing, I can tell you that is a great collaboration between lots of partners, all of them civil society, organizations that all debate things about European affairs, especially now with the European elections coming up on the 9th of June. But it's always relevant to discuss European affairs, so we're so happy that you want to join us. So without further ado, welcome to our panel. I will give a brief introduction of each of you, and then I will ask you to elaborate a bit about who you are and give us your brief, maybe reflections of what we've just heard. Well, Magnus, we already know you, so if it's okay, I will skip you this time, but we'll get back to you definitely. Vera, I'm not sure if is it okay with the microphone?
Well, let's check now. Can you hear me? Yeah, perfect. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well then, Vera, I'll just briefly introduce you and then you can continue on. So Vera Ingriskaya, almost, you can say better than me. You are an associate professor at the University of Copenhagen, which is part of Brussels and Regional Studies. And you've worked in Russia, Ukraine, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Turkey, China, and Uzbekistan. A lot of countries. And your research is mainly about post-socialist society, cosmopolitanism, economy, gender, migration, and much more. So let's give Vera first maybe a round of applause for coming today, and then we can get to.
Yeah, thank you, Zoe. Well, I think it was a slightly misleading introduction because I'm a social anthropologist, and anthropologists, they usually work with a theoretical issue or concept, and they try to test it in a different cultural settings. So my engagement with all this range of countries is, of course, not to claim any kind of deep, profound knowledge of each of these regions, but basically say that we see certain trends and we want to reflect upon how they work in these different types of post-Soviet, post-socialist societies. And one of the main themes that I worked with, to summarize it very generally, is a topic of coexistence. Basically, what does it mean to coexist? What does it mean to coexist with difference? Which kind of practices are there that allow us to have peaceful coexistence? So, of course, this war, it's a kind of a test of all those practices that couldn't be fulfilled, that we were looking in a pro-war situation. And some of them are related to the issues that have been mentioned by Magnus, namely this identity issues and questions of aspirations. And as anthropologists, we often look at challenges. That is to say, we look at what's happening in the society, what this aspiration to EU pose in form of challenges to the Ukrainian society and Ukrainian nation. And I will try to cover some of these things in our discussion later on.
Sounds great. Thank you so much for this introduction and looking forward to hearing perspectives. Next on, I would like to present Svetlana Tsykunova. Hope that my pronunciation is not too off. You are an energy expert from the Ukraine Center for Political and Economic Studies, and recent research has focused on the clean transition with an emphasis on energy, decarbonization of energy systems, including design of renewable energy-friendly markets, regulatory frameworks, energy efficiency, and sustainability. So welcome. Let's also give you a round of applause and
Thank you. That was the right introduction. I have been working in these areas for the 5 years. Today I would like to concentrate on energy issues, if that would be interesting for the audience. And I would I will focus on what actually the EU accession or EU approximation means for Ukraine and for EU in terms of energy, and so how it will influence the markets and also developments, and how it would help to rehabilitate Ukraine and Ukrainian energy system.
thank you so much, and really looking forward to hear, especially like you mentioned, Magnus, these sectoral policies. You mentioned agriculture, but energy is also a huge sector that we will, we're already having a lot of European integration on this topic, but how will we actually manage that and couple that with our practices and common identity? So thank you so much for joining us. Last but not least, I would like to introduce Natalia Popovich. I'm very bad with all your pronunciations, I'm very sorry, but I tried. You co-founded the Ukraine Crisis Media Center to amplify Ukraine's voice in the wake of Russia's annexation of Crimea and occupation of Eastern Ukraine. You also lead the agency One Philosophy, working on with the global corporate clients and states and international institutions. And you've also founded the Resilient Ukraine Civil Society Organization, housing the website weareukraine.info. And then you also engaged at the Ukraine House in Denmark. So lots of engagement. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for your kind, thank you very much for your kind invitation and kind introduction. Everything is correct. I hope to contribute. It's a sort of neighborly visit for me because Ukraine House is just across the street from here. Yeah, I hope to contribute first and foremost, I think, with comments towards Magnus's research, and I'm happy that it took place and you met with some of the topics that I shared with you. As for Kyiv, I was a participant in the Revolution of Dignity, and the formation of Ukraine Crisis Media Center was in many ways a response to countering Russian disinformation 10 years ago. So it's been quite a long time since we were engaged in this battle of identities, if you will. And as Ukrainian identity was growing more and more European, I think there was more and higher chance becoming that Russia would attack, and that's what happened in 2022. So happy to delve a little bit more in depth in terms of what does it mean to be Europeans for Ukrainians, or how to better maybe explain these aspirations. There are some things that the Ukrainians are very inspired about in Europe, and then there are some things that they're extremely disappointed about in the EU. So I think we could tackle those issues.
Thank you so much for your kind introduction. And so we will hear all of your reflections and thoughts in each of your specialized areas. And you're also very welcome to ask questions and just raise your hand. And people over here, if I'm like ignoring you because I'm sitting like this, just like shout or something, then you're very welcome to also ask questions. So we'll take those along with the debate. But actually, let's continue with your reflections on what we hear on this European identity and how you have seen it evolving. Please do continue.
Well, maybe just as a first reaction to what Magnus has said, because truly, I think Ukrainian society has gone through, as Magnus had mentioned, at least three major revolutions. And you all know that the last one was actually one that brought over these European flags to the forefront of the Ukrainian society. I recall very vividly how myself and my colleagues from communications agencies at the time were creating one of the first manifestos of Maidan, and it was called European Manifesto, and it was obviously adorned with the European flags. And mostly for us at the time, I have to say, EU choice was about rule of law. It was about actually ensuring that things that had happened in the streets of the European capital would never be able to happen again. Because as you know, the former government in Ukraine, President Yanukovych, felt that it was possible to simply beat up students on the streets of a city that expressed, a will that was contrary to what he was trying to sign off in terms of his new deal of kind of enslaving Ukraine to the Russian Federation through credits and gas dependency. So Ukrainians came to the streets to defend not only that choice, but also the rule of law. So in that country, the rule of law was associated with EU. So the territory where actually, courts function, where you can defend your dignity and your citizens' rights. And I think this was very, very important for Ukrainians at the time. And I think it still is. I think this is still, prevailing perception of rule of law is something that we associate with Ukraine and something that we feel very sort of deeply about because, Ukraine remembers and knows that we were one of the first nations in Europe to live according to a certain constitution. We all remember having the constitution of Philip Orr. So we being one of the first, democracies on the planet. And we also remember that even in the loose times of, let's say, 11th century, there was a code of law that already governed, these lands at the time before we even could talk about the formation of the Ukrainian modern state, but kind of pre-set history of Ukraine already had these very, very important things. So I think that is extremely important and remains. And that's something the Ukrainians will continue to expect in whatever shape it's form when Ukraine is doing the negotiations for the accession to the EU, because nobody, I think, had expectation that it would be walking in the park. Obviously, there are economic and other interests that will be at play. But given current situation, if we're talking about Ukraine's recovery, Ukraine's potential accession to the EU, obviously, everyone expects that it would be within the real law, and that's extremely, extremely important. Another obvious area, I think, is that Ukrainians perceive EU to stand on the grounds of the values that would be very often mentioned, but not always necessarily stood up for, let's say, in the last 7 years of the EU evolution. And by that, I mean things like equality, solidarity, fraternity, things like, ultimate equality of people and perceptions of them. I think this is where Ukrainians right now may have, may feel sometimes disappointed because I think there is, regardless of the fact that we have predominant, 86% or 90%, over 90% of Ukrainians want our country to join the EU. And obviously there is this total feeling of being part of the European family. But at the same time, I think there is a feeling that it is a World War III, where only Ukrainians right now are putting up, millions of lives at stake, basically. And even though we are receiving a lot of military and economic and other support, but at the same time, sometimes it feels like our lives matter less than the lives of the state started aggression against us, because the entire sanctions policy is structured in a way so that Russian people would not suffer. But at the same time, Ukrainian people already are suffering a great deal. And I think that means that we don't have yet complete common understanding of what victory should look like. What does it mean to not only bring about victory, but secure you and secure your. And I think Ukrainians have questions about that, because if all rights are equal and we all stand up with democracy and freedom, then obviously, you know, there is an expectation for even more solidarity, I would say. And that's maybe something that Magnus has heard when he spoke to some of the stakeholders, but I think that's very much shared across the Ukrainian army, Ukrainian civil society, all the actors in Ukraine, that right now all of our lives are at stake, basically. This process.
Thanks a lot on those reflections. And I think you touched upon these very core themes of, one thing is these things of rule of law, democracy, equality, solidarity. Those are, on the one hand, things we write in charters and write in rule books, but it's also values. And values are human, values are coupled to identity. And this is why I find it very interesting to hear what are these different perception sets? Because as you mentioned, what is victory, what is solidarity? We all have, and as you also mentioned, very different perceptions. And Vera, I'd like to get your reflections on how have you perceived these differing understandings in your anthropological work?
Mm-hmm. Well, I would like to talk not how I perceive them, but how people in Ukraine perceive them.
Yeah.
So I think it's very important to make this differentiation, because sometimes people think that I'm talking about my opinion, but right now I'm talking as an anthropologist who done research. And I'm very happy that this question of the rule of law and of the human rights is put on the agenda as one of the kind of key points about how this membership, how Ukraine's membership can be negotiated, how it can proceed. And of course, I had a question to Magnus about this quote, your quote from your informant saying that, you know, EU is just like, why is they just so focused so much on this kind of bureaucracy, or is it just a bureaucratic decision because we are feeling to be European and we just should have this access. And I would just wonder who was saying that, because if it's a politician, it's a bit a strange quote, I think, because as everybody knows in Ukraine, well, at least in cities, you know, this rule of law and human rights, it's a question of legislation. So that is to say the point about legislation and to which extent Ukrainian legislation corresponds to EU constitutions and to requirements of the Council so it will correspond to these norms. It was after Orange Revolution. And then there are two different kind of processes happening here. On the one hand, there is a disclaimer. I can't guarantee that it's a truthful information, but it's what I've been told. Because, you know, there was a commission, Ukrainian scholars and legal expert that was financed by, who were actually checking the correspondence. So every legal draft that would go to the parliament would first check whether it corresponds to the requirement. Rights and intellectual property rights, where this fine tuning and checks. But then suddenly in 2008, the financial kind of aid for the work of this commission was withdrawn. So basically, there were no more legal experts who would do it as a matter of fact for all the legal provisions going to the Verkhovna Rada, to the Ukrainian parliament. And then this very problematic aspect of Ukraine nation building and European requirements in the area of human rights, minority rights, and what is called Charter of the Regional and National Minority Languages. That is, of course, a very explosive topic that was dealt with for quite a number of years. And it's an issue that still hasn't been resolved. But of course, now it's sort of contextualized in a totally different situation when one of those languages that should be protected, according to this charter, is the language of the aggressor. So how to deal with that? The discussions still continue. But the point is, and it's what European politicians remind us all the time, that they say Ukraine joined the EU is not only a political decision, the legal aspect of it that guarantees the correspondence of the legal basis is very important for this process to proceed in one way or another. So I just wanted to show you this application that I was part of this project. It was financed by the European Union. It's about language policy in Ukraine. It was an international team of scholars, Ukrainian scholars from Kyiv Могила University, and legal scholars from the UK, and anthropologists, because they also need somebody to kind of report the situation on the ground. And there were some recommendations, and I can't remember all the reason, but I think the main point at that time, and we're talking about 2006 to 2009, was that of course the Ukrainian state has to actually support the Ukrainian language, that the policy would be to promote and support the use of Ukrainian language as a national, the only state language of the Ukraine, rather than trying to suppress other regional languages. So that was the kind of this disposition, and this debate I still continue how to deal with these issues. And then I don't think that those recommendations were actually taken seriously. And then these practices of verifying the legislation were also stopped just before Yanukovych took over. So, and now they will have to be dealt with again. So.
Okay, very interesting. I just want clarification. So on the one hand, promoting Ukrainian language, but then not suppressing the minority languages. At what, how does that play together? And maybe what is the focus today? Because is it the same focus as back then? Because I'm assuming that the Ukrainian language is also has a whole new energy in it, you could say, throughout the population. Maybe a few words.
Yeah, no, it's a very relevant and very big question, of course. So, I mean, since that time, there were several new laws adopted. So this whole kind of constellation was restored and different provisions were taken. And of course, what changed from the situation in 2000 to today is one very important point for Ukrainian language is that the prestige of the Ukrainian language that was quite low at that period became quite high, right? So that's a question of prestige. That is to say, now one doesn't have to talk about missing cultural product, right? So, but at the same time, and it's also mentioned in the reports of this Juliana Besler-Dilger, who is one of the key specialists in that area, that one has to take into account that this attempt to shift into a new language, or let's say Russophone or Hungariaphone or whatever populations, we're not talking only about Russian language, into Ukrainian as the main language of everyday communication, it's a very unstable process. So we had a very big kind of shift taking place after the annexation of Crimea. There were also this tendency to use Ukrainian more because people felt that, you know, they were kind of violated, and it wasn't a response. There were also lots of refugees from the Russophone eastern parts of Ukraine to the west. So it was also a necessity for many that, like, you know, now we can actually use this language, right? They couldn't use it so much before. It's maybe a bit early to say, but a similar tendency we're having today with the war of attrition, where people get very tired, you know, because of the war, it's a constant stress. So, and we're also seeing that this kind of initial shift, a massive shift into Ukrainian also falls back a little bit. And we, of course, do not know how it will develop in the future. So the situation is in flux. It's not one for all.
Can I just contribute to maybe a little bit to this? Maybe a little bit to this question, because I think it's important to mention that obviously the legal frameworks, they kind of carry on and they're overarching, and there aren't different, I guess, expectations on the side of the EU maybe towards these language or other frameworks. But at the same time, reality is changing very much on the ground. Right now, there is a full-scale invasion by the Russian Federation of Ukraine. And what I see in Ukraine and what research I think right now proves is that the switch to Ukrainian language that is taking place right now, finally, for many people, it's happening extremely consciously, not only because of the war, not only because Russian comes together with bombs and missiles, and that obviously turns off a lot of people from using that language, but it also comes from the fact that in the last 10 years, I would say, more than in the first 20 years of Ukraine regaining its independence after the Soviet Union and the horrors of Soviet Union, Ukraine started elevating the knowledge of Ukrainians and people living in Ukraine, what has happened to the Ukrainian language, something that they were deprived of for dozens of years. So people in Ukraine 10 years ago may not necessarily have known that Ukrainians disappeared from the Luhansk region as a result of the Holodomor, man-made famine in 32-33, when millions of Ukrainians died. And then these areas died in the most horrible of ways from hunger, because of Stalin's policy to exterminate millions of people. And they were so traumatized that they would never be able to carry on their Ukrainian identity because they knew that being Ukrainian, speaking Ukrainian would lead you to either deportation, exile, imprisonment, or killing. But at the same time, instead of the people who were killed, the Soviet policy was to bring people who would be from the Russian Federation with the language being with them. So there would be this entire repopulation movement, which, honestly, according to all of the experts on genocide would say this was a genocide 90 years ago, and this is kind of exactly the same happening 90 years after. And the reaction of many Ukrainians or people, even from maybe not necessarily ethnic Ukrainian background, for them it's to come back to their Ukrainian identity. For people who have no Ukrainian ethnic background but want to live in the future free, democratic, political nation of Ukraine, they consciously choose to speak Ukrainian even if their maybe native language used to be Russian, but out of respect for the nation that is now carrying this war, against Russian Federation that is trying to discriminate. So there is a major shift taking place in cities and villages everywhere. There's obviously that shift that Vera is referring to, whereas people that flee from the regions that would be extremely Russified before, and now they have a chance to live maybe in western part of Ukraine, which was also Russified, but where Russification succeeded less. Because if you think about in beginning of World War II, there would be dozens of thousands of Ukrainians, and at the end of the war, with all of the deportations and sending people to gulags, it would be just a fraction of that. But still, Russification did not succeed in the western part of the regions of Ukraine. So, of course, now, as people are changing their of Ukrainian language culture, so that's very interesting indeed and important process. But also it comes not just from war and the legal frameworks, but also from Ukrainians learning more about the trauma of Russification and sort of consciously changing to address it. And that means learning more about Ukrainian history, culture, society, and capital identity.
Very interesting, and thank you for those reflections. Before turning to you, Svetlana, I have a feeling that Magnus, you wanted to respond to some of these.
No, I mean, I could only just affirm what you just said. But one of the guys, I think, am I turned on? Yeah. Okay, cool. One of the guys that I talked to, the guy who said that one enemy can create unity. He held personally. Of course, this is anecdotal evidence, but just to sort of specify this. But he personally he came from Luhansk, and the sort of the beginning annexation of Luhansk and Donetsk. He moved. In Kyiv was this. He was very much what do you call it? He was suspected of being sort of a fallen Russian in disguise by his fellow Ukrainians, even though he actually had fled those parts of the country and had no sympathies in that direction. He had, I should mention, had Russian as a mother tongue. just to say that the sort of the gradual change then sort of came all the way through then by the first invasion in 2022 when he personally sort of arrived at the realization that it will not be like possible for him to talk Russian anymore, and he only speaks Ukrainian, and because he said, it was another quote in my thesis, that Russian is a toxic language for him. And you both had sort of, we saw that vector from the eastern side of Ukraine, but we also had the MP from Rivne in the western part of Ukraine, who saw the exact opposite going on, that she had always felt part of a Ukrainian nation, but she also observed that Ukrainians from eastern part of Ukraine were coming to realize that they are like where they have maybe before had sort of felt they were sort of in this sort of split. They were now only subscribing to a Ukrainian identity.
Just a final note on this, it's just that it's also, yeah, it's also,
Yes.
it's also not just coming into Ukrainian identity, but it's actually for maybe some people coming from a more Russified regions in Ukraine to embrace more of the European identity, because with Ukrainian, it also comes, again, kind of leaving behind maybe some of the, I would say, remains of the kind of Soviet, being a Soviet person, you know, was being under the radar, not trying to very much participate in civil life, you know, expecting only worse things to come from your government, because these are the kinds of things that you would have got in the Soviet times. Now, again, it was very important in terms of Ukrainian and European identity in Ukraine. I think it's this resolution from the Revolution of Dignity, and Revolution of Dignity was very different from all previous ones, because it was about Ukrainians embracing that democracy needs to be protected every single day, that you have to become part of the civil society, you have to form new institutions, that you have to become more active, you have to become activists, you can't just be beyond politics, as we unfortunately see, you know, many do in the Russian Federation. So that is also switching to this more activist European side.
Thank you, and very interesting with this activist European side, and how we, how Europe, not just Europe, but how the EU, our European identity, whatever we want to call it, it becomes an active choice, and has very much been in Ukraine, especially. And I think and it's not too controversial to say that in Denmark, just because we're located here today, it's quite a different perception, but also we don't have this like active citizenship as much. But then I would like to, both of you are also active in the business sector and in different sectoral policies. And I would like to couple with your expertise on energy, because that's one of the sectoral policies that is already getting much integrated between Ukraine and the EU. European integration in this area has been going on for a long time. But how has these, not, of course, the Russian aggression as an event, but how have these different developments affected your sectorial area, and also in terms of institutions, businesses, and maybe if you want to start and then you can reflect further in your expertise.
Yeah, today we are talking about how war impacted all lives and livelihoods, and how to get you know, to rehabilitate, how to reconstruct, how to, and that's what I would like to talk about a little bit. So we all were overwhelmed by you know, Russian invasion that impacted all sectors of economy, especially in energy. And right now, you have been following the news, and you have been reading a lot about the destruction, the massive attacks, and also shelling. And it turned out that 80% of the thermal generation have been destroyed recently. Thermal generation meaning that these are thermal power stations, and also the stations producing energy and heat. So those responsible for energy and heat supply. Why is it very critical for our system, energy system? because these stations were also serving as a maneuvering capacities. Because as you know, Ukraine is using the renewable energy, and we are committed to the green agenda of Europe. We have been accepting the basic fundamentals of the so-called Green Deal. And you also know about this Green Deal. This is making the European continent green by 2050. So Ukraine is completely committed to that. But of course, the war has destroyed a lot of infrastructure elements. So all these destructions, and as I said, even though the thermal power has been destroyed, the energy is still alive, and we won't expect the so-called blackout. And people don't know the essence of the word, but they are always telling about some kind of horror in terms of blackout. It is not possible in Ukraine because the whole system is a sort of unified electricity system or energy system. It was developed in such a way that it's not possible to just lose the control over all elements of the system. So blackout is not possible, but the challenges, yes, this is something that you perfectly will be talking about to pursue, and especially with the help of our European partners, that will be possible. So let me just elaborate a little bit on the very essential things that are right now in the energy sector. So despite the war, Ukraine has been, as I said, committed to the transition, and it has been doing a lot in order to stay, committed to its previous obligations. So first of all, just before the war broke out, the electricity grids of Ukraine and Europe were synchronized, and that was critical for Ukrainian system because actually it was planned for 2023, but in fact it happened in 2022, just before the war broke out, and that's thanks to our partners again in Europe, especially there is an organization which is called SOE, which is European Network for Transmission System Operators, and they managed to help Ukraine and Moldova to synchronize our grids. What does that mean for the economy? It means that when Ukraine produces electricity, which is in excess of its demands, it can sell it to European countries who are experiencing the lack of electricity, and it can generate funds in order to be spent for some other sectors. Yeah, very important in this period of war. Also, when Ukraine is lacking electricity, as it happened a few days ago, Ukraine was able to get some electricity, to buy electricity from other European countries. So that was really a great event. Sometimes, of course, it is not working very efficiently because we still market company, and still maybe standards that Ukraine is using now do not correspond fully to the standards of Europe, but we are working hard in order to match and in order to perform this market company. When we talk about the legislation, in spite of war, Ukraine has been working hard in order to transpose the legislation, European legislation, into Ukrainian legislation, especially in the renewable energy sector, which is very important for Ukraine, and it is developing and it is fast growing. And about the transparency of the wholesale markets. And it's also very important, and Ukraine managed to do it even though the war is there. So the market integration is going on. We are trying hard to perform this succession and this approximation to all European standards. So when we talk about possibilities of implementation to rebuilding of Ukraine, and we always have in mind that it has to be greener and better. So we have to build back better and greener. And of course, there are a lot of different programs that should be used in order to make the rehabilitation possible. Sometimes these calculations are not very, very much down to earth. Sometimes it's very philosophical because no one has done the technical audit, because everything is destroyed and the destruction is there, and we don't know what to expect. So it's not possible to have the right amount of money that Ukrainian system would acquire, not necessarily the energy system, but just the economy as a whole. Because as you know, a lot of industrial enterprises have been destroyed in Ukraine. Not just Azovstal, which was very, very famous, and it's not there anymore, but a lot of other enterprises. And in that respect, Ukraine is becoming greener, and that's not because of, this is a big development, but just because of the industry. We lost a lot of industrial enterprises. So when we are talking about rehabilitation, and we recall the famous conferences in Geneva and other places, the representatives were, talking about enormous amounts of money, and sometimes they were not, seriously. All these ideas were not seriously accepted, probably by the audiences, but. Yes, the investment would be reluctant right now to invest into the economy, which is destroyed, and we don't know what to expect tomorrow. So we are also working. Am I taking too much of your time?
It's okay.
So
It's okay.
we are working hard in order to protect the foreign investment. And one of the means to protect the investment is the providing the risk insurance. And the risks insurance is something that would probably make investors safer and help them invest into some of the critical infrastructure or some facilities and some other sectors that are really critical right now when country is trying to survive, and it's still alive and it's still working in order to rebuild, in order to bring victory, whatever we mean by this word victory. So I just brought you down to earth a little bit, but if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And it's great to get that very concrete on-the-ground perspective of one thing is identity as an idea, as a philosophy almost, as a how do we understand it, but once something else is how is this then implemented in real life? And European integration, it is an economic project as a start, at least. Then we have added a lot of things on top of it. But market integration is also people integrating together, and how what does it mean exactly when you guys mentioned legislation as a driver for common understanding, for getting the same rules, basically more integration. And some of this legislation, as you mentioned, is a lot in energy, in the energy sector, many other sectors. So it's great to get that connection from kind of the on top level of what do we mean by Europe, and what is there a common understanding, and then how is that transposed in a way into each different sector. And here is a great example. And I'd love to hear your thoughts also from your business experience and your reflections.
I would like to maybe build a little bit, and thank you so much for mentioning the recovery conferences. There are these important mechanisms that Ukraine has with not only European Union, but also G7 countries, and I would say all of Ukraine's allies, about how to best recover Ukraine, given that the war is still very much active. So Ukraine every single day is losing thousands of people. Our cemeteries, unfortunately, are growing. Russia is not stopping its attacks, and even though, as Svetlana had shared, it's brilliant that every month practically. But every few of my trips were in my apartment. I would have to always have, the candles and the lighter, and your life. It's very, very different when all of a sudden in the middle of a city like you experience in Copenhagen, you have to deal with being without light. Yeah, it's not complete blackout, but it still affects life very much. But going back to the recovery conference, so there are these recovery conferences where sort of Ukraine says, this is how we would love to rebuild our country and make it exactly even better, greener than it was before, very much in accordance to all of the EU legislation and frameworks that are, sort of progressive in EU. But at the same time, I think from business perspective, in my work, with the number of companies in Ukraine who have made a conscious choice to invest in Ukraine as a democratic country, the democratic society, and thankfully there are international brands like that. There is a little bit of left solidarity and understanding how sometimes just putting an emphasis on economic integration has been not really well thought through in the past. Because think about it, I think the entirety of the trade and economic relations in Russia in the past were sort of was this thinking that if we trade with Russia, if we grow dependent on them, somehow that will make Russia a democratic state, and it will be all hunky-dory, it will be peace forever. And EU, as you recall, I mean, has grown its dependency on the raw materials and high cargo world, right? For many years.
Natural gas, that was something that Europe was completely dependent
For
on.
years. So in a way, unfortunately, EU was contributing to Russia growing more and more wealthy and more carbon producing, which goes very much again the green future of all of us and the climate, what the things we want to achieve in terms of climate change and etc. Just based on economic integration. And there was never sort of a precondition very much put forward, at least in the last 25 years, where we saw it is again regaining its imperial mission. It is fighting wars in multiple locations. It is in Georgia, and then it has come, to Ukraine, but that's still carried on. And right now, if we're talking about the fact that right now Ukraine is preparing for a very important conference, which is going to take place in Berlin in June. And now already we know that this war is not a quick war. It's war that's been taking place already for 2 years. Why? Because Russia can afford to wage that war. Why? Because Europe has not disintegrated in terms of provision materials that end up in Russian missiles striking on Ukrainian targets. There hasn't been a disentanglement in terms of economy from Russia. Even in oil and gas, we see, how on LNG, how on these shadow fleets, Russia is able to earn quite a lot still, even in on a per day
EU has grown into on Russia, it wasn't able to do it, quick and easy like that. And this is extremely dangerous because on one hand, we're speaking about solidarity and values, we're putting Ukrainians a little bit in an impossible position. So Ukrainians have to stay alive, counter the Russian army that wants to attack everything and destroy everything that it sees in its sight. Build back better simultaneously, hedge everybody else's risk in terms of doing business in Ukraine. But those are, there's a lot of expectations. So I think from the Ukrainian perspective right now, it's extremely clear. The solidarity the Ukrainians are expecting is don't be providing us with help on one hand, humanitarian, economic, military, but don't continue to feed Russia at the same time, because then this war will go on forever. Pick your side, like do complete disentanglement so that actually Russia is deprived of the financial and economic and other resources to be able to purchase shaheeds from Iran and other things from China, but also things that end up in Russia because of European companies still present there, still paying taxes, still employing people, still contributing to the Russian budget, which is continuously, as we all know, being militarized. So EU has to have the resolve as a state, or as a combination of states that are very, very democratic, that want to see democracy prevail in the world. They have to have even more resolution to stand up to an empire and an autocratic regime that wants to conquer more, more influence and more territory. So I think this is sort of the very clear understanding you have to have. To rebuild Ukraine, first you have to disentangle the Russian completely.
And I think you make an excellent point on this. So this resolution of Ukrainians is not just about an idea of solidarity, and the same from Europeans or the EU and towards Ukrainians. It's very concrete. It's one thing is saying a lot of beautiful and nice words. Something else is the actions, and you can't feed two mouths at the same time. And so I think that's a very important point to remember. Are there any final reflections on this? Otherwise, I will go to questions from the audience. If do you want to add something?
Yeah,
yes, please go ahead. Then think about your questions before.
Just a few words. Yeah, we are experiencing sort of existential war. Dangerous, horrible word, but yes, this is the war of resources. So as soon as Russia has resources, it has its right to continue what it does to Ukraine, and other countries are also endangered because according to the military experts, these empire ambitions of Russia are still growing. So Ukraine, of course, God forbid. Then the other countries would become easier victims. I'm talking about Moldova, I'm talking about Kazakhstan, so former Soviet republics, including also NATO countries can be also in danger. And of course, unfortunately, the sanctions do not work properly. And so Russia is still capable of trading, is still capable of earning a lot of money to finance the war, including not just all those fleets, these shadow fleets, as you mentioned. So sending a lot of oil and gas to China and India, and also the refineries are capable to produce the products that are sold out to other the countries of the world. So as long as Russia is capable to do that, Russia is a danger to the world. Yeah, that was my point.
Thank you. Yeah, and please, if you have any questions, so we have really very varied expert panel with both civil society, business, policy analysts, energy specialists, everything you could dream of. And also to mention that many of you here, since I have the privilege of knowing who you are with your registrations, I know that all of you are also very interesting people, come from different organizations and have a globalist mindset. So thank you for coming, first of all. And I see we have many questions. So I will walk around with my microphone. And then I think we will try to take two questions at a time, and then make them brief, because it seems like we have great requests. You and then you.
I would like to hear your position about there are some different countries in the EU that there's some different countries in Europe that is on the brink of let's say EU membership, and I would like to hear you about how you view you know the challenges because some of these countries also have democratic problems, and so how do you view the fact that on one hand, we want, you know, a stronger EU by, you know, having more member states, but at the same time, it's to stand stronger against an aggressive America. But at the same time, some of those states also have democratic challenges.
So you talk a lot about this, Ukraine's identity and comparing it to Europe's. What is the Ukrainian identity right now? Because you talk a lot about like the EU as of like Europe. Like because Ukraine is a part of Europe, geographically. But you talk about it in like kind of in a way that it doesn't seem like that. I want to understand like how Ukraine is viewing Ukrainians and the Ukrainian country as of currently, kind of in compared to EU and European identity in general.
Can you remember the questions? Can you take one more? Because I think we have a really interest. I have a question here, right? I lost my thing, so maybe just.
Thank you. My name is Lars Wisman. I would like to ask you, how much is the population of Ukraine able or willing to sacrifice for their freedom instead of the alternative becoming a Russian puppet state? As I see it, you must win a military victory and defeat Russia and force Russia to get a negotiated peace before you can enter the European Union. During the Great War, the Second World War, Russia was willing to sacrifice 20% of the population. Your conscription age today, or yesterday, was 28 years. Today it's 26 years. In Denmark, it's 18 years. We conscript young people for military duty when they are 18. So what are you willing to sacrifice?
Thank you for some questions. Who wants to start?
Maybe I can pick up on the first one because thanks for the great question. In my presentation, I stayed mainly on the Ukrainian side of things because that's what we're here today. But I did also did similar research in Brussels, and what I can tell you is that there is an ongoing conversations because the reservations you present are completely valid. There's also part of the conversation that you're having in Brussels. Two things. The one thing is that I think by way of what Ukraine is currently going through, the EU is also realizing its, we call it normative power in terms of mobilizing Western-minded forces in sort of candidate countries to fight for European society. We see it right now in Georgia right now. We also see something similar in Moldova. Right now, you have, I don't know if you've seen the pictures, but there's a lot of pictures coming out of Tbilisi where you have thousands of young people taking to the street to not to mix apples and oranges here, but also fighting a government that is taking, say, a more Russian turn. So one thing EU is realizing that its own normative power in that capacity. Secondly, to your point about what does what's the conversation, is there a dilemma there? There surely is. Firstly, as you rightly mentioned, we need to make sure, I say we, the EU needs to make sure that countries coming into the EU live up to the Copenhagen criteria before coming in, because we right now see with Hungary, we also saw it recently, up until recently with Poland, that if they don't, or even if they did when they got in, if they start to backslide, we don't have mechanisms to keep them in check. I mean, the European Commission, the sort of the toolbox that you have available for them, can't do a whole lot there, because on the one hand, you want to approach these people, you want to welcome these people who obviously fight and strive for a European future, and as a European, as a EU European future here. using that term vaguely. And on the other hand, you also know that if you expand the club, it's going to be even more difficult to make hard decisions on some different. Has been notoriously difficult for EU to make common decisions on, say, sanctions on Russia, because it only takes just a one member, as the rule stands as of now, to veto anything like that. And so there is a conversation in the EU, and I think that's probably what's going to happen, that the EU is going to need to reform before we take on more people, more countries in the EU. I don't know if that's
Any other takers for more of the questions?
Yeah.
Sure.
Would you like to?
I would like after you.
So maybe on the, yeah, so I think in terms of the first question, I think it's extremely rational. Join the EU club. I believe that in case of Ukraine is part of the solution rather than a problem for EU. The skill set that Ukraine brings right now, it would make EU stronger. And I guess this is what we also hear from Charles Michel and von der Leyen and everyone else at this point. Ukrainians feel, and I think, as far as I'm concerned, have felt, the majority have felt always European. And there is no contradiction in that. It's just that Ukrainians have felt that most recently, they had to sacrifice thousands, hundreds of thousands of lives for the very values that are being mostly talked about in the EU and in the more sort of peaceful and prosperous side of Europe. And here I would like to come back to maybe kind of loop into your question, because I think it's extremely important. When we talk about any peace negotiations, or when we talk about any sort of agreements that sometimes come as end of wars, from a Ukrainian perspective right now, if you look at Yalta Agreement, which ended Second World War, for the Western Europe, probably it was a good thing, because it has brought a certain stability and ability to prosper, and that's why the word prosperity sounded so much and very often in economics research. But please understand that for the eastern part of Europe, central parts of Europe, which is most starting from Eastern Germany and then through Czechoslovakia, or now Czech Republic and Slovakia and Hungary and Poland. Even all of these countries have seen Russian or Soviet tanks on their streets long after the Second World War. For Ukrainians, it meant occupation. For Ukrainians who aspired to have Ukrainian independent state, in the interwar period, that meant that they had to fight the war as Ukrainian insurgents until 1954. So here, Europe was already recovering, while in Ukraine, people were still fighting, for their existential right to exist, to be Ukrainian. So right now, it's kind of a similar framework, whereas some, stakeholders would say, put a stop here if possible and negotiate, even though it's completely unrealistic, because as alluded, Russia has no intention to stop. Like, I mean, if Russia wanted to stop, we would probably, that would be more not a theoretical but empirical discussion. But Russia is still showing no ways of stopping, and I think we all need to just be very, very mindful of the fact that this country is further militarizing. Majority of its public expense already this year is going to produce more soldiers, more weapons to kill people outside of the Russian nation. And in that regard, when you're asking us a question for how long would we fight, well, Ukrainians don't have a choice but not to slave them. And plus, it's a slavedom of informed citizens who already know from history how that looks like. Because if before borders were closed, people could live completely influenced by the Soviet propaganda and without access to information of what was happening in the Russian gulags. of Russia and as kind of a dominant force in the Soviet Union, bringing millions and millions of people freedom in most of the, neglecting most of the republic. Again, and that's why you have such force coming not just from Ukraine, but you also have it coming from Baltic states who are already members of EU and the NATO, because they know how it's been. They've lived there. In terms of Denmark, probably only those people who are Danes living in Bornholm Island can tell you how it is to be in that level of Soviet occupation, and we can relate to that. Probably most of more than others. So we don't have a choice but to fight, and you know, it was millions before, because Ukraine has lost more than others in the Second World War. Unfortunately, somehow some European countries felt that they have the responsibility for Second World War more towards Russians and Ukrainians, but it's actually through Ukraine that the war went to Stalingrad and then back, and Ukrainians lost more than any other Eastern European nation in the Second World War, millions of people, both in the armies and among civilians. So it will have to take millions, unless, again, we come back to solidarity, unless we come back to rational thinking on the EU's part, and there are stronger sanctions, there are closing of the loopholes, there is complete disentanglement from Russia, that the EU defunds Russia's ability to wage that war, and then yes, Ukraine will be in a much stronger position to sit down and have justice take place.
I wanted to add just a few words on to first of all, accession of Ukraine and other countries that are striving to be a part of EU. I happen to be a part of the international project doing a research on how to actually include all these countries striving to be a part of EU, and what has to be done in terms of legislation, in terms of economy, infrastructure, and political things and stuff like that. And it is called Resilient Europe after Europe gets new members. So I strongly believe that there could be an option that Europe becomes more resilient when all the members that are striving to be a member of EU fulfill their homework and do everything possible and do all necessary reforms just to become a part of EU. So that's what we have. The perception is that EU would become even more resilient with all new members, provided that they have fulfilled all their commitments. In terms of how long can we, if I remember the right question, can we? My institution is always doing the social polling and asking people's opinion on very important topics nowadays. And one of them is whether Ukraine is going to continue, and how long can it continue? And 80% of all population say that there's no choice. Ukraine has to go and to win, and they cannot even imagine some other scenarios, like being part of another, empire. That's how it is. And these results are very recent results. So that's it.
Thank you so much. I think we'll, I know you have a thought, but hold it and we'll take some more questions. You had the question. Is there anyone from this side who wants to be democratic side? No, not yet. Okay, we'll take you and then you and then you. And yes, please state your name after us.
Thank you very much for such great insights to all of you. I'm Oksana. I'm a political studies specialist, but not in Ukraine. I'm a Ukrainian scholar in Denmark. Very quick, but very short. My question is about the. I would like to touch upon some sentences about Ukrainian new identity. do you somehow, all of you, think that Ukrainian identity has also changed much in the recent years since the time it has become candidate for EU membership, also due to show it. I've made some examples because there are lots of talks about the fact that Ukrainians really understand what EU in a different way. So
Thank you so much for that excellent question. Now I already forgot who was the second person. You. Yes.
Yeah, I guess I will. Thank you so much for the presentation. My name is Daniel, and attending different keynotes, like I get your perspectives, but I've also heard other perspectives, and it's not to put a discussion on what's going on that I might have put in. But like you're saying he's aggressive, other people saying he's not. It's just about like creating this buffer zone between NATO and EU and then Russia on the other side. So I would like to know, in case, for example, which, Russia is proposing a peace negotiation or peace deal, serious to put it. So two questions for that. What do you think, like, should the EU, no, will EU accept it? And do you think EU should accept it? So like, did you get the, like, your personal views? Like EU, if EU will accept it or should they accept it?
Thank you. And I just realized we're already over time. So if you can keep your answer or your question short and your answers short, then we'll all agree.
Yeah, I'd like one word, one concept, and I think maybe you had a euphemism calling about institutionalization. What they want in Ukraine is that for corruption, because one of the big obstacles to the accession of Ukraine is corruption, which is one of the most corrupt countries in the world. Before, I don't know, maybe it's improved now, but we talk a little about that.
Thank you for those two questions. Who would like to start? And again, very briefly, if it's possible. Anyone? Any takers? Yes.
I just would like to sort of clarify your question, because you said what you will think if what, like if.
Oh yeah, if Russia proposed a peace negotiation, and then I would like to hear if you think the EU will accept it, and maybe also your personal viewpoints if you have.
Well, I mean, I think it also relates to the way we think, to the way we interpret the invasion right now, because lots of analysts, they focus on identity politics, on this buffer zone, as you mentioned. Yeah, but there is also like a very big trend within cultural geographies. It actually points, maybe we should not like make it more complicated than it is. We're talking about land grab, right? So it's just kind of an expansionist policy. So the question is like, will then those negotiations that you are mentioning potentially involve kind of stepping back from the land grab or not? If yes, then I don't see why anybody would be objecting to that. But if that was the whole purpose of the enterprise, then it's sort of difficult to envision this scenario.
Thank you so much. And I propose that because we are at the end, already at the end of the session, if you're able to stay for maybe 5 minutes and answer the last two questions with the people who asked, then from my side and the whole team behind, I forgot to mention that my name is Zoe and I'm the co-founder of the European Debate Initiative, and which is one of the organizers behind today's program. Thank you so much for joining us in this delightful discussion. And I mean, thank you for the panelists, thank you for you. Let's just give everyone a round of applause.
Zoe.
And we're free to stay to talk and to network, but now the floor is open for informal program. Thank you all. You were amazing. Thank you for making us all very